Their names were whispered from beneath the ground. At first we thought the wind was moving through the soil. Sounds strange now, but when you're deep in the woods your mind reaches for simple explanations first. The campsite sat in a shallow clearing ringed by old firs, their trunks rising like pillars into a dim ceiling of branches. The ground was thick with needles and loose earth. When the breeze passed through the trees, the soil sometimes shifted softly, releasing little sighs of air. That was what we told ourselves the first time we heard it. A faint whisper, not a word, just breath pushing through dirt. We had set up camp late that afternoon after hiking most of the day without seeing another person. The trail had disappeared hours earlier, replaced by faint animal tracks and the occasional broken branch. Our phones had lost signal sometime before noon, but the clearing seemed perfect. Flat ground, a fallen log for sitting, and a small stream trickling somewhere nearby beyond the trees. By nightfall we had a fire going and our tents pitched in a loose circle. The forest around us was quiet in the way deep forests often are, not empty but distant. Insects hummed far off in the undergrowth. Something moved occasionally in the brush, small and careful. Nothing unusual, until the whisper came again. Soft, right beneath our feet. We all heard it this time. Someone laughed nervously. "Did you guys?" The ground shifted slightly. Not a tremor. More like a slow settling of loose soil, as though something beneath the surface had exhaled. The whisper followed. Clearer now, still too faint to understand. We stared down at the dirt around the fire. The soil looked normal, dark, damp, scattered with pine needles and the occasional stone. But as we watched, a small depression formed near the edge of the clearing. Not deep, just the ground sinking inward by an inch or two. Then another depression appeared a few feet away, and another, like footprints pressing upward from below. None of us spoke for a moment. The forest had gone quiet. Not the usual nighttime quiet where distant sounds continue faintly. This silence felt deliberate, as if everything living nearby had paused to listen. Then the whisper came again, and this time it said a name. Daniel. Daniel froze. The voice wasn't loud. It wasn't even clear. The sound seemed filtered through layers of soil and stone, like someone speaking from far underground. But it was unmistakable. His name. We stared at him. He stared at the ground. "That wasn't funny," he said. None of us had spoken. The fire crackled once, sending sparks upward. Then the soil shifted again. A new depression formed near another tent, and another whisper slipped upward through the earth. "Maya." Maya backed away immediately. The whisper wasn't coming from one place. It rose from different patches of ground each time, drifting up through the dirt like breath escaping a buried lung. Then another. Jonah. Another. Leah. Each name spoken slowly, carefully, as though the land itself were sounding out unfamiliar words. We stood in a rough circle around the fire, listening to the soil breathe. No one suggested leaving immediately. It seems obvious now, but in the moment something held us there. A strange heaviness in the air, like the clearing itself had closed slightly around us. The whispers stopped after the last name. The forest remained silent. No insects, no animals. Even the wind seemed to slide around the clearing without entering it. One of us knelt carefully and pressed a hand against the ground. "It's cold," they said. Not surface cold, deep cold, like the temperature several feet below the earth. The depressions we'd seen earlier were still there, scattered across the clearing floor, each one about the size of a human footprint, though none had distinct shapes, just smooth indentations. We tried to ignore them, tried to return to normal conversation around the fire. But every few minutes the soil shifted again, releasing faint sighs of air from beneath the clearing. And sometimes we heard fragments of words moving through it. Not sentences, pieces, syllables. Our names repeated in uneven whispers. The longer we listened, the more we noticed other things. The ground wasn't flat anymore. It dipped gently in long shallow arcs around the campsite, as though something enormous had once pressed downward there. Several of the depressions aligned in curved rows leading toward the center of the clearing. Cold patches appeared too. When we stepped across them, our boots sank slightly deeper into the dirt, and the air above those spots felt several degrees colder than the surrounding ground. One of us dug lightly into the soil with a stick. Just a few inches down, the dirt became darker, packed tighter, and threaded with pale shapes. At first we thought they were roots, but the shapes were wrong. Too smooth, too curved. We covered the hole again quickly. The whispers began returning more often after that. Not just names, other sounds. Low murmuring tones that moved slowly through the soil beneath our feet. The words weren't in any language we recognized, but the rhythm carried an odd familiarity. Like chants remembered imperfectly. The forest around us remained utterly still. Hours seemed to pass that way, or maybe minutes. Time felt stretched inside the clearing. The fire burned low, and the whispers grew stronger. Now we could tell they weren't random. They moved. The sound traveled through the ground in slow currents, circling the campsite the way water flows around stones. Then gradually those currents began converging. Toward the center. Toward us. We realized something else at the same time. The whispers weren't asking for our names anymore. They were repeating them, over and over, testing the sounds, learning the weight of each syllable. And beneath the repeated names we began hearing another pattern. Older words, buried words, rising slowly through layers of dirt that had not been disturbed for centuries. We looked around the clearing again, at the shallow arcs in the ground, at the rows of depressions, at the strange alignment of cold patches surrounding us. One of us whispered the thought none of us wanted to say. This isn't a campsite. The clearing had the shape of something deliberate. A circle. The depressions formed rings within it. And we stood exactly in the middle. The whispers grew louder. Our names rolled through the soil beneath our boots. But now the voices sounded different. Not distant. Closer. Like the ground had thinned. The soil at the center of the clearing shifted suddenly. Not collapsing. Opening. Just slightly. Enough for a dark line to appear in the dirt. Cold air spilled out of it. The whisper that followed was no longer faint. It rose clearly from the ground at our feet. Not repeating. Not testing. Speaking. Choosing. Our names moved slowly through the soil again. One by one. And when the last name was spoken, the ground beneath that person's boots sank just a little deeper than the rest. A thin mist clung to one person in the group and refused to leave them. At first we thought it was breath. Morning in the forest had that kind of cold, the kind that turned every exhale into a pale cloud drifting through the air. When we stepped out of our tents at dawn, the clearing was full of it. Little wisps hanging over the ground, sliding slowly between the trees. Normal mountain fog, except one patch of it didn't move. It hovered around Eli. We noticed it while packing up breakfast. The rest of the mist had already begun thinning under the rising sun, dissolving into the warming air. But around Eli there was still a faint gray veil, trailing his shoulders like smoke from a dying fire. "Hey!" someone said, pointing. "You see that?" Eli turned. The mist turned with him. It stayed close to his body, clinging to his jacket and hair without actually touching him. A narrow plume drifted behind him when he walked, then coiled lazily back into place around his chest. We laughed at first. "Static fog," someone joked. "Your personal cloud." Eli waved his arms through it. The vapor scattered briefly, then pulled itself back together, gathering again around him as if drawn by invisible threads. That was the first moment we realized something was wrong. The forest itself felt normal enough. The clearing where we'd camped sat in a shallow valley surrounded by tall firs and old cedar. The ground was damp with moss and fallen needles. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in thin vertical columns. But the air around Eli was colder. We could feel it whenever we stood near him. Not dramatically cold. Just enough that our breath fogged when we stepped within a few feet of him. Even though the rest of the clearing had warmed. The mist stayed there all morning. When we hiked out of the clearing and followed the slope down toward the creek, it came with him. Wind didn't move it. We crossed an open ridge where the breeze should have scattered fog instantly. Our jackets flapped, branches swayed, loose needles skittered across the ground. The mist never shifted. It hung around Eli exactly the same way, drifting slightly when he moved but never leaving him. Animals noticed before we did. Halfway down the ridge, we startled a deer grazing near the treeline. It bolted immediately when it saw us, but as it passed Eli, it veered sharply sideways, almost tripping over its own legs. It ran the long way around him. Later we found a stretch of muddy ground beside the creek where raccoon and fox tracks crisscrossed the bank. But around Eli's footprints there was a wide empty circle. No animal tracks crossed through it. Not even birds. We joked less after that. The forest was quiet that day. Not completely silent. There were still distant insects humming somewhere beyond the trees, but the usual chatter of birds had faded. Occasionally we'd hear one call from far off, then fall quiet again. The mist seemed thicker by afternoon. At first it had been faint enough that we could almost ignore it. Now it clung to Eli's shoulders in visible layers, thin tendrils drifting down his arms and pooling lightly around his knees. The temperature around him dropped further too. When one of us brushed against him accidentally, they flinched. "You're freezing." Eli laughed nervously. "I feel fine," but he looked uneasy. That evening we made camp beside a narrow stream. The valley there was deeper, the trees older and more widely spaced. Their trunks rose like pillars from the mossy ground, their upper branches weaving together far overhead. The mist followed Eli into camp. It curled around him as he gathered firewood. It drifted beside him when he crouched near the stream to fill bottles. Even when he sat down by the fire, the vapor hovered around his shoulders like a pale cloak. The firelight passed straight through it. We noticed something else then. The smoke from our campfire avoided the mist. It rose normally through the air until it drifted near Eli. Then it bent away as if encountering an invisible wall. None of us commented on that out loud. Night came slowly beneath the heavy canopy. The temperature dropped, and the forest grew quieter. The last insect sounds faded after sunset. The stream continued its steady trickle somewhere in the dark, but even that seemed muted now, as if the valley were absorbing sound rather than carrying it. The mist thickened further. It now reached from Eli's shoulders to the ground in thin drifting sheets. Sometimes it stretched outward slightly, as though testing the air around him, before recoiling back into its tight cloud. We tried shining flashlights through it. The beams bent strangely, scattering into pale streaks inside the vapor before emerging on the other side. One of us walked a few steps away and looked back. "You can see it from here," they said quietly. From a distance, Eli looked like a lantern, not glowing, but outlined by the faint gray shape of the mist around him. The forest beyond him remained perfectly clear. We sat around the fire longer than usual that night. Nobody wanted to be the first one to crawl into their tent. Eli eventually stood up. "I'm going to get more wood," he said. We watched him walk toward the treeline. The mist flowed with him like a tide. And as he stepped between the first two trunks, something strange happened. The forest reacted. Not dramatically, subtly. Branches above him shifted slightly, even though the wind had stopped hours earlier. Leaves rustled once and then went still again. The silence deepened. Eli stopped walking. "Did you hear that?" We hadn't, but the mist around him expanded suddenly. Not spreading outward, stretching upward. Thin strands of vapor climbed slowly into the dark spaces between the branches overhead. As if reaching, we stood up. "Come back," someone said. Eli took a step toward us. The mist resisted. It didn't stop him, but it lagged behind for a moment, pulled taut between his shoulders and the trees above like pale threads. Then it snapped back into place around him. We saw the shapes in the branches then. Not bodies, not creatures. Just darker spaces between the limbs where the mist had briefly touched. The outlines looked wrong. Too tall, too narrow, as if something standing far above the ground had leaned closer for a moment. Eli came back to the fire quickly after that. The mist settled again around his shoulders. But it no longer stayed close to his body. Now it stretched upward in faint vertical strands, disappearing into the canopy like invisible tethers. We didn't sleep much that night. Every time one of us opened our tent and looked out, Eli was still there by the dying fire. And the mist was still clinging to him, reaching, waiting, toward whatever had begun gathering silently in the branches above.